So, good evening. Welcome to Dusty Feet. It's December 29th, 2022. This will be our last live stream of 2022. But this week, we're going to take a journey on a story between Judah and Joseph and the echoes that are heard later. You know, those echoes, they have an effect. They even have an effect on the lineage of our Messiah, right? So here's a teaching from Rabbi David Fohrman that'll give us some things to think about, and then to continue to see how those stories connect, which I like. And we have Outside the Class, where we want you to review the material before we start chatting about it. Kind of like homework. We continue on our Matthew series, with Tim Mackey, of course. We recently posted episode 22, Severed Heads and Hungry Crowds, Part 1. I do link all the videos for each week on TheDustyFeet.com on the Outside the Class page. So check them out so you can look at the videos ahead. Those videos premiere every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Eastern. And don't forget, in the description below are links to all the audio, video, and source documents we use here on the Dusty Feet. We want to make sure that any material we use here is properly credited to those folks who work so hard to bring it to us. Without their efforts, learning we do here does not happen. So don't forget to subscribe. Click that bell icon if you want a reminder. And as always on the Dusty Feet, this is a place we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation, where belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. So here we go with some more AlephBeta on the Dusty Feet. Okay, so this is a video from the folks at AlephBeta with Rabbi David Fohrman. It's an older one, but it's still important, I believe, right? So let's take a listen. It's only about 8 minutes, right? Let's see where things might connect, and then we can start asking questions. So enjoy the video.
This is Rabbi David Fohrman, and welcome to Parshat Vayigash. This week's Parsha contains one of the most dramatic moments in Sefer Bereshit, in which Yehuda comes to the aid of his brother Binyamin. Binyamin is imprisoned, framed by Yosef. The brothers don't know that Yosef is Yosef. He's just a high Egyptian official. Yosef has placed his silver goblet in the sack of Binyamin, and as the brothers leave the city, Yosef dispatches his armed guards to track them down. Yehuda said, "Search our belongings, we have nothing to hide, and if you find anything, the person that's found to have taken the goblet of the king shall die." Well, when they found the goblet in Binyamin's sack, what's Yehuda going to say now? Yosef says, "No, don't worry, I'm not going to kill the thief. I'll just take him as my slave, the rest of you can go." What's Yehuda supposed to do? Yehuda had promised his father that he would bring Binyamin back alive, but he had never thought that Binyamin would steal the cup of the king. He doesn't know he was framed. Most of us would have gone back to Yaakov and said, "Look, what are we going to do? It's true, Binyamin was taken captive. We should count ourselves lucky that Binyamin's still alive." But that is not what Yehuda does. Yehuda makes a last-ditch attempt to save Binyamin by any means possible, and those means include an impassioned speech that he makes to Yosef. In that speech, he tells the whole story, the painful story. "You don't understand," he said. "Our father had already lost a child of his beloved wife Rachel. If you take this last child of Binyamin from him, the last remaining vestige of Rachel," he says, "Nafsho kshura b'nafsho. My father's soul is bound up with Binyamin's soul. If you take Binyamin from him, he'll die. Please take me instead." There was a time when Yehuda had allowed a brother, a child of Rachel, to be sold in slavery because father loved Rachel more, because father loved that child more. but now would not be that time. Now Yehuda says, I know that my father loved Rachel more than my mother. I know that he loves Binyamin more than me. I know that his soul is bound up with Binyamin, but that's okay. Take me instead. Let Binyamin go back to his father. It's perhaps Yehuda's finest moment, and it succeeds in ending the long, painful story of the sale of Yosef. Yosef cries, reveals who he really is, and the long charade is over. But let me ask you this question. Where else in the Torah do we hear these words? Nafsho kshura b'nafsho. One person's soul bound up with another person's soul. So it turns out that the language appears in the book of Samuel, in Sefer Shmuel Aleph, Perek Yud Chet, chapter 18. Let's read together some of these verses. The verses appear in the story of David and Goliath. In that story, Goliath had threatened the first king of Israel, Shaul. No one from the Jews felt that they could fight him. And then this little shepherd boy, David, rises to the challenge and miraculously fells the giant with a stone from his sling. Ukashuv David ma'akotat haPlishti, and when David returned from killing the Philistine, vayikach oto Avner. Avner took him, vayivieu lifnei Shaul, and brought him before Shaul the king. V'rosh haPlishti biado, and the head of the Philistine was in his hands. Vayomer elav Shaul, and Shaul said, Ben mi ata hanar, whose child are you, my son? Vayomer David, Ben avdecha Yishai bet halachmi, I'm the child of Yishai from Beit Lachem. It's very strange, by the way, that Shaul should be asking this, whose child are you? The truth is, Shaul knows who David is. Before this, David had already been playing the harp for Shaul. They knew one another. But somehow he gets this question. And by the way, listen to the question, not just who are you, whose child are you? David's response, I'm the child of Yishai. Next words, Vayihik chalotel ledaber al Shaul, and after David said this to Shaul, Nefesh Yehonatan nikshra b'nefesh David. The soul of Yehonatan became bound up in the soul of David. It was like an intertwining of the souls. Vaye'aveo Yonatan knafsho, and Yonatan loved him like his own self. Here we've got these echoes of the Yosef story. Yehuda had once talked about this. Yehuda had said that Yaakov's soul was bound up with Binyamin, and now the Torah is using the same language to describe Yonatan falling in love with David. Why are we quoting from the Yosef story? What does this mean? Vayikacheu Shaul bayamahu, the next words, and Shaul took David that day, lo netano lashuv beit aviv, and didn't let him return to his father's house, kept him in the palace. Vayichrot Yonatan v'David brit, and at that moment Yonatan and David made a covenant one to the other, bavoto knafsho, because Yonatan loved him like his own self. Vayitpashet Yonatan at Me'il, and Yonatan took off his cloak. Vayitzneu leDavid, and gave it to David. What's going on here? What's going on is that we're hearing the ripple effects of the Yosef story, because these men are the descendants of the two prime actors in the Yosef story. Because who is Shaul and who is Yehonatan his son? Shaul is a king from the tribe of Benjamin. Oh, and who is David? David is from the tribe of Yehuda. Yehuda and Benjamin one more time. In the story of Yosef and his brothers, Yehuda risked his life for Binyamin. Yehuda came face to face with the recognition that his father loved Binyamin more, would rather have Binyamin home with him than Yehuda. And that was okay. Yehuda says, take me instead. It's okay. You can love him more. When did Binyamin ever repay Yehuda for that? Yehonatan repays that debt. Because what does it look like from Yehonatan's perspective when David comes back triumphant? If you're Yehonatan, who's next in line to become king? You are. Who does your father love? You. Now who does your father love? Look at how Shaul is treating David. Shaul took him, adopted him as his own son that day, and didn't allow David to return back to his father's house. You are mine. Shaul knows that David will one day become king. And what would that mean for Yehonatan? For Yehonatan, it's the greatest threat you could possibly imagine. But that's not how Yonatan sees it. V'nefesh Yonatan nikshra b'nefesh David. The heroism of this child of Binyamin mirrors the heroism of the original Yehuda. Yehuda had once said this for Binyamin. Now a child of Binyamin will say it for Yehuda. It's not threatening for me that father would love another child more than me. Let father take David. I love David like my own soul. And then he takes off his cloak, strips himself of his cloak, and gives it to David. What does that remind you of? Oh yes, there was a time when a child of Rachel's did have a cloak stripped by Yehuda, forcibly in the sale of Yosef. Now it's not forcible. Now the child of Rachel, child of Benjamin, willingly strips his cloak and gives it to the child of Yehuda. It's a moment of healing, a moment in history where at least at that brief point, the two sides of the family were reconciled. Because at the moment when a man faced his greatest possible threat, he turned his back on his own welfare and loved his brother from the other side of the family like his own self. The memories of the sale of Yosef run deep, but the heroism of Yehonatan is that he didn't remember just the animosity. He remembered the sacrifice too. He remembered the love. And in that remembrance lies Yehonatan's greatness.
So loved your brother as yourself. So we have some interesting things to talk about. As you know, we really enjoy connected patterns in Scripture. And Rabbi Fohrman has a special way of pointing out these possible connections. Right? One thing I enjoyed about this thought was, should I have seen these connections before? Was I ever taught to even look for these connections, right? I know that for the greater part of my church life, the Bible was mostly focused on the New Testament, of course, right? The Gospels, and mostly letters from Paul, right? So it's been an eye-opening journey to not only really engage with and dig into the Old Testament, or like we'd call the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible, right? But in that digging, with the help of the folks of like Rabbi David Fohrman, Tim Mackey, Skip Moen, right? Those things in Scripture that bind the stories together, they seem to appear, right? Most of the Bible study for my churchanity days seemed to focus on even on limited sections, short stories, and often not even the whole story. Vignettes that might tell a story taken out of context sometimes, and that can be skewed to tell a different story. Now I can see and grasp the need for a whole story concept, right? This context. When these guys that we study with, when they go so much beyond that, not only the full context of a story, a single story, but the wider views that show a greater context and a connection between those stories. I know that Skip, he has a wide-angle view of this entire scripture of scrolls, right? And tells the story that God cares. The folks at the Bible Project, they like to use the phrase, a unified story that leads to Jesus. And I'll be so bold as to even stretch that to Messiah, right? But the folks at AlephBeta and Rabbi Fohrman, they say this, to create relevant Jewish learning, to take people on a deep journey through the text of the Torah and emerge with meaningful and satisfying answers to some of life's biggest questions. They believe the Torah study should be evidence-based, intellectually stimulating, emotionally gripping. So I actually enjoy all three of these, and I think you can see why. So this story of Judah and Joseph, right? It meets all of the above. I love the connections and the patterns, and as you've heard me use the word, footprints. That's my way of saying, where have we seen this before? My fun challenge is really multifold, and I'll try to explain. So as I journey along probably with dusty feet. My footprints leave a mark for where I've been. I can say, been here before. And that can get even more complicated because that also entails a bit of me looking around and seeing things. We all know what that's like. We visit a place, and when we return, we can remember our way around halls, paths, at least a bit. But more often than not, more often than I care to admit, we don't really see all that. We don't see everything that's around us. It's like going to a museum or a garden. You walk around, you enjoy the view, you take in what jumps out at you at the time, what grabs your eye. But return to that place and you see more. It was there before, but this time something else caught your eye. You know you've been here before. You remember the path, but there's more. So here's part of my point. I'm finding it an interesting observation about myself and my past in a way, as I am rereading scripture and taking the time to look around again. Two things come to mind and one caution. So I'll share the caution first. In thinking I know where I've been, and I don't really need to go there. I don't need to pay better attention. I've read this before. It might even be boring, seemingly inconsequential, trivial. So I have intentioned to not do that, to ignore the regular or familiar at the expense of missing new things. And it's turned up some engaging and stimulating things that I haven't noticed before. So I'm looking again, and I can ask, have I really been here before? That really has a deeper question of, if I've been here before, why can't I remember? But if I have, and that's good, then stop, look around, and see what I may have missed. So all that brings us back to this video, the story of Judah and Joseph, and the story of Jonathan and David. In this case, it was very interesting because I had been here before. I've read the two stories. But what have I missed? What else was there for me to see? On a cursory glance, one could say that these stories are just two very good Bible stories, of which that is true. But if we stopped again, looked around, see this path that we've traveled on, what would we see? I have to admit, this can get a little geeky sometimes, but I've really grown to enjoy this different view. I've walked around places, I've enjoyed the views even, but sometimes not stopping to read a plaque or a little plate below an item, a sculpture, a picture. And that has the opportunity to bring more clarity to what I'm seeing. That happens here with lineage, okay? That sub-story that is often, if not always, overlooked, and maybe even seemed as, what did we say before, inconsequential. When I miss that bit of inconsequential, and I miss an entire layer between these connected stories, and then I mix in my view of some elements that can be misunderstood, I can miss even more. So we get to Joseph, the original victim in this story, a wrong perpetrated so many years ago. And there's an opportunity to let that fester and grow into a resentment that could be unbreachable, right? And if it were me and I had been Joseph, I'm not sure, really, to be honest, that my response would have been the same as Joseph's. Judah's plea to Joseph could never take back or undo the damage. And that's also what Judah knows, right? His dad is in a crumpled state. Judah's come to peace with the fact that his dad, Jacob, right, has a favorite wife, and it's not his mom. Jacob's wrapped around this son that he lost from his favorite wife. And there's so much not really right with that, but it's too much to go into today. Maybe we'll do that at another time. Yet Judah comes to terms with it. Then, in this turn of the story, Joseph sets up Benjamin. Again, part of that doesn't seem right either, does it? But again, we'll leave that for another time too. But, even with these two parts, we see that there's even more to see. But we'll stay on this path that we're on tonight, okay? So Judah is in a plea with Joseph. And he doesn't know yet who that this is his long-lost brother. And Judah doesn't even really know what happened to him after that, right? So Judah really has no idea. And then you have Judah, and he truly believes that if he does not return with Benjamin to Jacob, it's going to kill his father. So I love this element for two reasons. One, that people can and do change, and they really want to do it differently in the future. Selfish changes to others. And two, we're at the beginning of a wider picture, a seed that will grow beyond our view in so many ways. These two, Judah and Benjamin, they're just people here, but their lineages will be part of the 12 tribes of Israel, right? These sons of Jacob. It's even more complicated. But they do create a lineage and a bond. And then the story moves forward. Do I believe that interaction between David and Jonathan, that they would have realized that they were in some kind of redemptive moment? I'd be willing to say no. Yet in the story as it's captured and shared, we have an opportunity if we're willing to really look, and we're going to see these kind of possible moments where God's footprints can be seen. He has been here too. Let's see what he's left behind for us to notice. Just like I said with Judah and Joseph, that interaction between Jonathan and David, I'm definitely not sure I would have reacted the same as Jonathan. He's the son of the king. And in that time and culture, he's the apparent heir to the throne. I couldn't do that. And did we miss the connector between the coats? Did maybe our fascination with a possible rendering of a multicolored coat distract us from the recognition given and the purpose of the coat and the implications of being more than just a gift from his dad? But if we might have understood the coats in the context of the culture and the time, along with that little plaque under the picture, we might have deemed as insignificant. That's from the tribe of, right? Then we had an even more impactful moment than Rabbi David Fohrman has pointed out. Yeah, these two stories, they're very much connected. very much redemptive qualities, and they very much show why when we hear the words or read the plate under the picture of Jesus, don't get me started, but when we read the tribe of Judah, that story, it means more. The story of the lives that only through hindsight, those shared and passed down, show a way to undo something. In a way, it reminds us of different ways of redemption, whether we see it or not. Where would Benjamin have fully appreciated the fervent plea of Judah? He was totally unaware of the actions of Judah with Joseph. He didn't know that. But in that, in the life lived afterwards, that action had an equal and opposite reaction. But not opposite as against, right? But to give back, to return. Because really, if I was the heir if I was the parent, the heir to the king, and the king took a liking to somebody else, okay, whoa, that is way, way beyond me. We get upset when people have an opportunity to take our job somewhere. But Jonathan was a special individual of a heart and an intuition that was beyond us for sure. Yet, it played out through the entire lives of Jonathan and David. How deep, how loyal, how impactful might this bond become? And even more with Judah and Benjamin and their lineages. One of the saddest and lowest points in the history of the nation of Israel, that's besides the carrying off of them all eventually into captivity, but it was the civil war that prefaced it all. That's the real beginning of the end. Yet, which two tribes stuck together to become the southern nation? Judah and Benjamin. Those ties, maybe they run very deep. Let's remember that little verse in the Bible, Romans 8:28, right? And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who were called according to his purpose. Seems maybe it's not a new thing at all, that Paul is just telling the community in Rome, pay attention, because know it or not, if you're one of those that love God, then you could be part of a redemptive story for others to look back on too. And only time will tell. Here's our point to ponder. And we're back to our Bible verse. Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. It's from Paul of Tarsus in a letter to the community in Rome. Again, this is not a from then on statement, and maybe it should be a part of our taking in of stories and what we see, right? Those things that connect us to the good work of God. Those things that work together for good, they very much might not happen in your lifetime. And yet, as we've seen, it can be very impactful down the road. So this is a verse that takes us to deeper and wider places indeed. And thank you for hanging out with us tonight on the Dusty Feet.